Okay, good morning. Welcome to CB4's webinar on how COVID-19 is changing G-Store demand. My name is Ben Nichols, and I'm the Senior Director of Customer Insights at CB4. And in my part-time, I'm also an adjunct professor of data science at Syracuse University. I've been working in analytics and data science for about 8 years. And coming from CB4, CB4 is a software company that works with retailers, specifically in the grocery, convenience, and fashion spaces, working with operations teams to uncover local hidden demand patterns by using sophisticated AI and machine learning software. So we're going to have a webinar this morning focusing particularly on the changes in grocery demand due to the impact of the current COVID-19 pandemic that's plaguing the world. So I'm really excited to get started today. And for those of you that are just joining, you also may, as we go along, enter questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom call. You'll see it on your Zoom panel as a Q&A chat button. And any of the questions that come up as we go along will be addressed at the end of the call. So I really implore you to stay tuned to the end, and I'd be happy to address any of the questions that come up as we go along. So today's webinar agenda is as follows. We're going to kick it off with just understanding the new retail landscape. And what we mean here is specifically trends in some of our existing grocery customer data and some interesting insight that we can potentially share with you all about other things that we're learning from our partners, but also the industry trends nationwide. From there, we're going to jump into a little bit about two new recommendation types that our data science team here at CB4 have been putting in many hours in surfacing for our customers. And specifically, we're going to be focusing on supply and demand problems. So here we have emerging trends. These are opportunities where we'll see surges in demand for specific SKUs in locations. And we want to be able to actually better support your supply chains and making sure that the new demand for these products is being met. And the second opportunity type that we'll share with you all today are supply chain opportunities. Now, both emerging trends and supply chain opportunities are a new way of looking at traditional retail, but it's not using anything overly sophisticated. These are simple analyses that we're able to conduct in Excel, and we'll be able to share with you a little bit about how you can use and take away that information for your own businesses. From there, we're going to learn a little bit of additional information about another analysis that we're conducting internally at CB4, pertaining specifically to the association of online ordering using other businesses like Instacart, or even for your grocery chains that may have your own in-house ordering options. We can see how those are impacted across your fleet. And then finally, we'll actually dive into a little bit more of our own homegrown AI solutions, uncovering novel consumer purchasing patterns using sophisticated artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms. So that's the agenda for today. As I mentioned, if you have any questions as we go along, in order to get through all the material, I am going to be saving them for the end, but we'll do our best to address all of those questions. And if there's anything that comes out of this conversation, we'd be happy to set up a follow-up with each one of you individually at your request. So we'll have some contact information as well. Okay. So getting started, we wanted to start by sharing a little bit about this new retail landscape that we all find ourselves in. So obviously, a lot of this will seem somewhat anecdotal because not only do you work in grocery, but you're probably, unfortunately, having to go to a grocery store and actually shop for you and your family. So hopefully some of this resonates both with you as the businessman, but also you as the consumer. So initially, when we first saw COVID break out in early to mid-March, we were noticing some of the following trends with respect to our grocery customers. So the 2 weeks before COVID really broke out, we were seeing typical Q1 sales across our customer base. Nothing really outstanding with respect to the economy. Everything was fairly healthy. Many of our customers were posting strong performance numbers in their respective businesses. But then immediately following the initial outbreak, and this would be the first, second, third week of March, we saw about an 800% lift, or an 8x increase in top line sales growth. So this is certainly an anomaly. The same way that, every day you go on the news and you're hearing yet another outrageous statistic. This is unprecedented. This is the first time we're seeing it. I can't speak for every customer, but certainly an 8x increase in sales over a 3-week period is somewhat astronomical. But what's really interesting is after this initial surge, what we're starting to see is a bit of a normalization week over week from a top line sales perspective. And one of our customers put it really elegantly in saying that, and this was as of last week, the current foot traffic that we're experiencing in their stores were that of an unusually high holiday season. So something around Thanksgiving or Christmas where individuals are stocking up for a large family meal. They're seeing similar expectations from their consumers, buying a lot of canned goods still, but also still now focusing a lot about in-home comfort, and we'll touch on that in a moment. Now, this should also not come as a surprise when we have some of our top grossing items in these categories, such as hand sanitizer, soaps, and vitamins. And more vitamins may also include some over-the-counter medication like Tylenol, Advil, etc. So this is just meant to serve as a benchmark and a baseline for where we've been, what has happened, and sort of where we're going. And for me, it looks as though we're starting to normalize consumers going to the grocery store probably once a week or so. So with that in mind, here are a couple of specific categories that we drilled down to looking at our customer point of sale data. And we're seeing on the whole, a lot of those initial surge spike items that consumers purchased, your frozen foods, your dairy, your pastas, things that generally have a little bit longer of a shelf life. Dairy, maybe not so much, but certainly pasta and frozen foods, people probably overpurchased. I know that my freezer is absolutely stuffed and the ice is falling out of the tray and falling out of the freezer every time I open it. Total headache. But I bought too much. So the likelihood that I'm going to buy pasta or frozen food in the next couple of weeks is really low. And we're seeing that not only as an anecdote, but across our grocery industry. But what we've really noticed is that there's a huge surge in in-home comfort products that you probably wouldn't have expected to see during the initial surge. Or panic buying that individuals were taking place, but now are really starting to take off because individuals are finding themselves at home a lot, and they want to feel comfortable even during the day or after work because there's no more commuting for a lot of us that are able to work from home. But for those of you that have to go and go into the store, maybe that's less relevant. And those specific categories fall into beer, liquor, and plants. And plants here is actually a bit of a surprise to us, but that includes things like bouquets, potted plants, things that make the home a little bit more inviting while you're stuck in quarantine or stay-at-home orders. So that's sort of some of the high-level trends that we're seeing. But again, what's really hard to predict is what's going to happen next week. And every day, new government orders are recommending individuals to stay at home, and a lot of these orders are actually hyper-local. I know, for instance, my county put a shelter-in-place order over the weekend, and the county next to ours doesn't have that. So these hyper-local consumer demand patterns are constantly changing. And what we're seeing in the grocery space is a challenge to keep up with what's happening on a day-to-day, week-to-week level. And this can also be seen with respect to that hyper-local. A lot of the trends that we're seeing are following state boundaries, state guidelines. Without this being a political conversation, I think a lot of the state governments are making independent decisions, and with that comes independent consumer purchasing behaviors. Every time a governor comes on and indicates that we're short on something, that leads to downstream impacts and cascading decision and logic for consumers to start purchasing different types of products. So on the left-hand side, we see the difference between Maryland and New Jersey with respect to the initial spike panic buying and then sort of a low tail off. And the difference between New Jersey and Maryland was more or less a one week change in shelter in place and in quarantining. It happened in New Jersey a little sooner. Obviously, this is without me necessarily knowing the details, but it likely has to do with its proximity to New York and how New York was really hard hit early on with respect to the coronavirus. And then finally, with respect to some of the additional grocery categories, this is just another benchmark statistic for some of the categories that we've seen really exceptionally high growth in. Dried beans, flour, cornmeal, pasta, etc. And I can speak again anecdotally that I know I bought way too many chickpeas or garbanzo beans. I know they're high in protein, and I have way more chickpeas than I'll ever eat. So I might have to get into the chickpea market after all and sell back some of the back stock I've acquired. But at the end of the day, all of these government and local decisions really make predictions and next steps hard. So with that in mind, we really want to figure out how do we actually go forward and make smart business decisions, because learning from the past has become much more challenging. In fact, if you look at, typical predictions, you might look over year. So what was happening at the same time in 2019? Maybe there were particular promotions going on in your location. Maybe there was an opportunity for you to pick up where you had a miss last year. Well, it's really hard to make those types of predictions, number one, because you don't know what's going to happen day to day, week to week. And number two, consumer purchasing behavior is completely all over the place. I recently read a study where 60% of consumers that are currently grocery shopping are throwing out typical consumer preference and simply buying what's on the shelves available to them in the moment. Additionally, that same cohort of individuals that had to just buy whatever's available to them, many of them are actually going to continue to use the new brand that they found available. So what this is going to do is going to completely shake up the CPG industry, the consumer packaged goods industry, and actually for them it's going to be a bit of a wild ride to figure out where it all shakes out after we start to normalize a little bit. Additionally, a lot of promotion-based decision making, a lot of seasonality is certainly taken into account over what's been going on in the last month. What do we anticipate happening in the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 2 months? But it's really hard to predict that. So in order to combat that, one opportunity would be to look over only really recent data. What happened last week? What happened the week before that? And using those shorter timeframes and decision-making criteria, you may do a better job predicting what can happen next week and the following week. So looking over short periods of time might actually benefit you in the current state. And then finally, another opportunity may be to look at similarities that don't usually stick out, but because of certain demographic information, you may be able to find emerging trends or opportunities by looking at what might be non-typical similar stores, but yet face similar circumstances to isolate opportunity. So here, an example might be that Tylenol sales, obviously this is a little bit outdated at this point, but Tylenol sales may be increasing 250% week over week. So these are the types of things that CB4 has been thinking about. And what we'd like to share with you today are a couple of different reports that focus on solving these niche problems that are impacting our current businesses. But also, we would love to extend to anyone on the call that's interested tutorials on how to put this together themselves, or if they're so inclined, we can also put it together on their behalf. And at the end of today's webinar, we would be happy to share with you those contact details for doing so. Okay, so after we kind of covered some benchmark statistics about where we are, where we've been, where we're going, we'd love to share with you a little bit more about some of the analyses that CB4 has been working on to solve these types of problems. So specifically, I really like to think of the first two analyses that we put together as supply and demand problems. So the first one, which we've titled Emerging Trends, for me, this is a surge in demand problem where we've isolated a few territories within a chain or within an organizational hierarchy that's beginning to identify and beginning to actually articulate a new trend in SKU level sales that's outpacing the rest of the chain. And we want to drill into those types of opportunities to see if the other territories are going to actually, come up to their level, maybe because they're lagging on a government-based decision or lagging on a societal change. So we want to have operations and merchandising teams prepare those particular SKUs and SKU categories to make sure they have enough on hand to anticipate and to meet the new demand as it surges in near real time. The second opportunity, which for me is the exact opposite of the emerging trend, these are instances of products that we've seen emerge as new consumer demand patterns, but where there may be one territory that isn't able to keep up with this new consumer purchasing behavior. So we've isolated opportunities using basic Excel and heuristics-based statistics to isolate particular territories that aren't meeting that local demand. And the idea being here is we can work with our partners to harden their supply chain and figure out what things that we can reduce in the bottleneck to resolve any of those issues at the supply chain or inventory management levels. So these are the two types of reports that we're going to touch on now. And again, I also want to implore anyone that has questions to put them in the Q&A. And even though we're going to be touching on future material as we go along in this presentation, I would love to hop back and answer any of the emerging trends or supply chain opportunities at the end of this call. So if you'd stay tuned through the end of the webinar, I'd be happy to address any of your questions regarding these analyses. So starting with emerging trends, as I mentioned, these are opportunities where we're seeing an emerging trend across a territory where across a chain where one or two territories are exceeding our reasonable expectation for the sale of a product. So here the expectations would be, or the potential actions would be, working with the store managers and preparing those territory stores that have yet to surge and making sure that there are units on hand of these products and making sure that they're able to, raise up to this new consumer demand level and actually be able to handle any of the new sale of these products. Number two, allocating stock intelligently among stores in territories based on these surging demands. So by isolating these emerging demand opportunities, we can work with partners to figure out which territories are relevant or less relevant based on their better understanding of these markets. So by working as a partnership, we can figure out which territories are high priority to make sure that we have units on hand for. And then finally, if we know that there are outstanding problems or challenges with the supply chain partner or vendor, we can also be proactive in working with them to figure out how we can intelligently route or reroute products that are already within your chain's purview. So that's really what an emerging trend is. And what I'd love to do now is actually show you an example that we pulled from one of our partner customers and show you sort of what we were able to uncover. So specifically, without sharing the customer's data particularly, imagine yourself to be a New York State-based grocery chain. So on the left-hand side, we were able to isolate, and this is again a real opportunity we saw for one of our customers. We were able to isolate that Diet Pepsi 12-pack is surging in two of the territories that we'll see on the right-hand side, being Western New York and the Finger Lakes territories. So because we isolated that there's an emerging trend in Western New York and the Finger Lakes, we may want to figure out for some of those lagging territories if there's an opportunity to make sure there are enough units on hand, and also finding similarities with respect to, apologies for that. So as I was saying, we've been able to isolate these opportunities for Diet Pepsi, and with having done so, we believe that hardening the supply chain for the other territories will prove beneficial in meeting this local demand as we in the next coming weeks. Now, so specifically, again, I can't speak to necessarily why Diet Pepsi would face this opportunity, but certainly I think it has probably to do again with Diet Pepsi not having been maybe in the initial surge. It doesn't seem like a requirement or a staple of anyone's initial diet, and it doesn't necessarily need to be something that someone panic buys, but certainly with respect to that in-home comfort, it's certainly something you may want to have as you spend more and more time at home. So moving on from the emerging trends, we also want to take a look at supply chain opportunities. So supply chain opportunities, again, for me, is the opposite of the type of problem we just took a look at. So these are instances where we've isolated particular territories within a chain as mostly selling very well, but there may be one or two territories within the chain that are lagging behind. And we want to uncover why that may be and figure out if there's an opportunity to resolve the supply chain issue. So here the actions to be taken would be something along the lines of identifying a local supply chain challenge and working with the vendor or DC to make sure that there are enough units on hand. So here's another example that we identified at one of our retail organizations, specifically it was a grocery customer on the Northeast, where we identified that California Olive Ranch, specifically the extra virgin olive oil 25.5 ounce, was not performing well in a particular category. Now again, imagine that we're a New York-based grocer here. The area or the territory that we identified the opportunity to be in is Central New York, and here the opportunity would be to uncover whatever supply chain blockage may be preventing us from selling through in this territory. And it might be related to the DC that covers that area, or a particular manufacturer or vendor that's able to distribute to this area. So here we would work with our partner to help act on and figure out what's going on. So this is an example of a supply chain opportunity. And again, this in combination with the emerging trends are simple reports that we're able to just use aggregated point of sale data, analyzed within Microsoft Excel, and using some threshold-based heuristics and statistics, isolate opportunities that we're able to share with our partners so that they can recoup dollars where they might have been overlooked. I think one of the hardest things in grocery today is really being able to focus in on particular ideas with pretty much a 4 or 5 alarm fire going on all the time. So really being able to focus in on a specific SKU or SKU category to make up incremental sales is a really big opportunity, even with everything else going on. So beyond those 2 new reporting types, which we refer to colloquially as the Corona reports here at CB4, we have a third new opportunity that we're working with 2 of our grocery partners at CB4 on, and it's learning from online ordering. So specifically for those grocers that have the ability for their customers to actually purchase online and either pick up in store or pick up or have delivered right to their home. Guilty. I use Instacart and they at my local grocer, and they deliver right to my home. So for those groceries that have that ability, we've actually uncovered some really interesting findings where online sales of particular SKUs directly correlate and precede in-store localized trends. And by uncovering this predictive aspect of certain products and categories, we're able to similarly, identify emerging trends for products that will be available or that should be available in store because of a surge in online demand. So these are opportunities and unique ways of sort of looking at omni-channel online versus in-store purchasing behavior and working with our customers to solve those types of novel problems in the face of Corona. Again, this is a little bit more statistically focused. We are using regression and correlation to identify these types of opportunities. But again, if this is something that would be interesting to anyone on the call, we would obviously work with you to either templatize an analysis, or we could also share data and figure out how we could best serve any of you on the audience. So with all of that in mind, we've really been focusing on simpler ways to analyze data and find ways to pick up SKU sales here and there, even with everything else going on. These have been looking at really short time frames, benchmark and statistics based on similar store ideas. But now what we're going to do is we're actually going to take a look at the CB4 system for identifying and isolating similar consumer purchasing behavior using AI, machine learning, and other sophisticated methodologies. Now, I'd like to remind you that if you have any questions or you'd like follow-up details about the other analyses, the emerging trends, the supply chain, or the online to in-store, feel free to either ask questions in Q&A if you're interested, or if you stay to the end of the webinar, I'd be able to provide you with additional details on how you can do outreach, and we can work with you as a partner to actually do that analysis on behalf of your operations or merchandising teams. So with that being said, I would love to actually talk a little bit more about leveraging advanced machine learning models and why they may be a better use case now more than ever. So specifically, a lot of the traditional retail analysis for demand planning and supply chain, supply chain coordination really comes down to the 3 main ideas. Number 1, time-based benchmarks. We touched on that earlier, but I just want to remind everyone that because of the, crazy outcome of the pandemic, it's really hard to use 2019 statistics to come up with 2020 predictions. So because of that, we really want to focus on much shorter time periods. Number 2, using traditional similar store benchmarks, it's really challenging to consider what one store versus another may be, given the local government and the local consumer demand patterns based on hotspots, based on the ability for a consumer to actually go to a grocery store, suburban versus urban. So these are really challenging problems to solve. And then finally, top sellers. The traditional top seller list might be completely thrown out the window. Number one, you may not be able to keep up with enough units on hand to actually support your top sellers. And number two, what was once a top seller may not be relevant. You know, if you have a really high, if you're a grocer that has a lot of prepared foods and some of your prepared foods are some of your top sellers, that might not be as relevant right now because consumers don't want to handle food. They don't want to have to package up their own food and work through that sort of difficult negotiation of potential risk and infection. Same could even be said for some deli partners or food service opportunities. So top sellers is really challenging because week to week, that top seller list is a sort of a moving target. So with all of that in mind, what we can actually do here at CB4 and what we've seen be really successful with our partners, even in these challenging times, is detecting operational issues using pattern recognition. And specifically with respect to pattern recognition, we can look over really small points in time. We can look over 1-2 weeks to isolate opportunities where things are still, fluctuating very volatilely, but also looking ahead 1 or 2 weeks to help make near instantaneous decision making on the floor by your store management partners. So specifically, CB4 scans point of sale data and searches for repeating consumer behavior patterns by analyzing different levels of demand for products using past weeks, so 1 or 2 weeks. Additionally, groups of stores that can have generally dissimilar demand levels overall could have really similar subsets of SKUs that do share similarities, and we're able to cohort our cohort stores together using fuzzy clusters by actually analyzing those interrelated SKU performances. Once we were actually able to isolate these fuzzy clusters, we can isolate anomalies within the fuzzy cluster to exploit opportunities where a store should be demonstrating high demand, but in reality is actually performing really low demand. So we want to make sure that the store manager investigates specific SKUs to figure out what's preventing the sale of that product. It might be something as simple as the product is in the back room, or it could be something a little bit more complex where that product is out of stock, but by the store manager actually, raising that information up to their managers and the operations supply chain managers, they can figure out ways to make sure that these high priority items are meeting their localized demand. So this is a little bit more sophisticated than some of the other analysis that we looked at, but this is sort of how CB4 is working in the wake of Corona and working with our customers on a regular ongoing basis. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to briefly stop sharing my screen and actually jump into the same solution that I just described in real time, looking at some Corona-related product opportunities that we've uncovered. So bear with me for a moment while I stop sharing and share my, my application screen. And now I've lost my Zoom share ability. One moment. There it is. Okay, so you should all now be able to be seeing my, my web browser. And the first screen that you should be seeing in front of you is our machine learning software and analysis platform, and it's called CB4's C Retail platform. So what this is actually doing is it's loading, or the way that one would use this particular piece of software is to load weekly point of sale data for SKUs and for SKUs and stores. And C Retail will scan all of that point of sale data and actually uncover recommendations or opportunities for store managers to resolve operational issues for specific SKUs. So on the aggregate, you see some statistics along the top. So we ran just a sample analysis from one of our grocery customers for which we've completely masked the data. So nothing proprietary here. But in terms of actually looking at the uncovered opportunities, we saw that this simple analysis from recent data uncovered 104 opportunities with an average recommendation value of around $2,240 per month. In total, across the 104 opportunities, if the store manager was able to successfully resolve most of these opportunities, we can anticipate slightly above a $200,000 increase in incremental revenue, which on the whole, if one was to do this week over week, even considering all the craziness with respect to Corona, you can anticipate around a $4 million increase in sales for this grocery chain. By the way, as a benchmark, this grocery has around 400 locations. And if they were to use CB4, they could anticipate around a 3% annual increase in net new sales. So these are just some top line statistics. But what I really want to do, and the reason for me showing this to you all today, is to actually take a look at the way that CB4 is solving and identifying opportunities given all of the hyper-local demand pattern changes from consumer to consumer, from day to day, from week to week. So what I'm going to do now is actually going to jump into a specific pattern that CB4 was able to uncover with respect to this chain's SKU level store sales. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a pattern of store level sales for specific SKUs. And where your mind may initially jump is market basket analysis. However, I want to distill that myth. CB4 is not here using market basket analysis, which for those of you who do not know, is an analysis where we analyze at the receipt level products which individual consumers bought together in frequent purchasing. So that's not what we're doing here. Instead, what CB4 is doing is actually analyzing the store as the protagonist, where we're identifying particular products in stores that sell either high, medium, or low together. And by doing so, we can actually isolate instances where one or two stores aren't selling a target product at the expected demand level. And we'll walk through this exact example to figure out why that may be. So in the Phoenix location for the Pepsi 2-liter, we actually saw that there was a very high probability. So this is CB4's internal KPI for a probability. There's a really high probability that there's a problem with this SKU in the Phoenix location. And if resolved, we can anticipate around $588 of monthly potential revenue across the two stores that we've identified this opportunity in, against the other 23 stores that display a particular pattern of demand that we're going to exploit. So here on the left-hand side, we have the CB4 secret sauce. So think about your grocery chain and how many locations and SKUs you have. You probably have possibly tens to hundreds of locations and possibly tens of thousands of SKUs. Many of our grocery customers have upwards of 25, 35, 45,000 SKUs. So all those combinations of SKUs and store sales leads to the possibility of billions and trillions of patterns. But what CB4 is able to do is uncover these local demand patterns using the artificial intelligence. That's where it sort of comes in. And what we're left with are these nice packaged groups of products that sell in particular quantities together. And I'd like to walk through one now. So this is an opportunity that we actually identified, which shares a lot of commonalities and anecdotes with Corona, specifically Corona-related products. So here we have when Purell hand sanitizing wipes sells in high demand. Advil pain relief sells in low demand. And I'd like to take a moment as a PSA, don't take Advil if you're feeling like you possibly could have the flu or Corona. It actually worsens the symptoms. So consumers in this chain actually felt the same way. So the Advil pain reliever was selling in a lower demand. Tylenol, however, is perfectly acceptable for you all to take. I'm not a doctor. My wife is a nurse though, so maybe some of that rubbed off on me. So take Tylenol, and here Tylenol sells in a high demand. And when Kleenex Cottonelle bath tissue also sells high. And finally, Wonder Bread is simply sold in this location. I'm sure that there are locations within this chain where Wonder Bread is not sold, but in this case, Wonder Bread has to be sold for this pattern to hold true. When all of these conditions are true, then we would anticipate that the Pepsi 2-liter would be selling in a high demand. So again, when all of those products are selling at those demand levels, then Pepsi sells high. And let's actually take a look for a moment at this distribution of sales for the Pepsi product across the entire chain. If you randomly walked into any chain, you could anticipate more or less an even distribution of Pepsi across any one of these, any one of your stores. So for instance, 32% of the stores in this chain's locations sold Pepsi in a low amount. So 33% sold low, 30% sold high, medium, and 29% sold high. So more or less, it's a crapshoot. You walk into a store, it might be a high Pepsi location, it might be a medium Pepsi location, it might be a low. However, there are also a few stores that don't sell Pepsi at all. Maybe these are exclusively Coke partners, so maybe they're not selling any Pepsi products. However, rolling back to the pattern that we looked at earlier, when all of these market conditions hold true, then Pepsi should be selling high. And in fact, when these conditions hold true, Pepsi actually surges to 92% likely that it's selling in a high demand. However, and this is where the anomaly detection part kind of kicks off from the CB4 perspective, there are 2 locations within the 23 that have all of those other commonalities among those products, yet are selling Pepsi the 2-liter Pepsi in a low amount. So there are 2. So ideally, we want to figure out what's going on in these 2 locations that's preventing the surge to high demand and is actually presenting with a low demand. So that's sort of how we can actually go from simple point of sale, isolating clusters of product sales, and isolating and anomalizing single store locations, and in this case there are 2 that are selling in a low demand, and trying to uncover why that may be. So the next screen we're going to take a look at is a little bit more about the actionability and benchmarking about what makes those 2 stores different. So among the 452 locations within this chain's fleet that do sell the Pepsi product, they sell on average $2,500 worth on a monthly basis, so over 4 weeks. However, if you'll recall, those 23 stores in the pattern, the pattern being that group of similarly selling high, medium, and low demand products, those 23 stores are actually selling almost 50% more than the average across the fleet. So they're selling at $4,500 worth per month on average. However, remember that there were 2 stores that shared those commonalities, yet they are selling in a low velocity compared with the other 23. So here they're actually selling only for $2,500. So there's about almost a $2,000 gap that could be made up if we uncover the hidden operational issue. Now, another important note here is that even though we've isolated that these 2 stores are underperforming with respect to that SKU, the Pepsi 2-liter, in fact, they actually are selling above the average for the other 452. So in reality, this is when we look at sort of benchmarking or traditional benchmarking and time-based analyses, these 2 stores may have been overlooked as having been typical performers of Pepsi. But the novelty here is that CB4 has uncovered, even with all the things going on with Corona, that there's still an opportunity for these 2 stores to be selling more Pepsi because of consumer purchasing behavior that we've identified. Okay, so this is just a simple example or one example of how CB4 uncovered an opportunity for Pepsi, given all that we know about the things that are going on with respect to Corona, and how if this Phoenix location figured out why Pepsi isn't selling through, perhaps could incrementally accrue an additional $588 conservatively, but up to maybe even $2,000 on a monthly basis just for the sale of Pepsi 2-liter. So once we've uncovered a set of opportunities, and again, our analysis uncovered 104 of these, we'd actually be able to apply a level of business logic. So for instance, maybe in your chain, there are certain categories that simply, it wouldn't make sense to try to uncover operational opportunities. Or perhaps you don't want your store manager focusing on low-hanging fruit or not focusing on low dollar value. Maybe you only want to send recommendations that have an incremental revenue amount of $200. We can apply that logic using a filter. And once we've selected the set of recommendations we feel comfortable with, we can then go ahead and click on this deploy button, which sends the recommendation directly to the store manager or store associate, whoever you've allocated to execute the tasks. They can take a look in their web application, which we will do in a moment. So again, CB4 ingests point of sale data, isolates business opportunity, isolates an instance of a store that can execute a task, and then we can send those tasks directly to store managers, and they see it in their handy store manager task list. So these are not the same recommendations we just saw in the C retail instance, which was the pattern recognition software. Instead, these are just a different set of recommendations that were generated for the Phoenix location. So in this case, let's imagine that Snickers bar should be selling in a high demand, but we've identified that it's actually selling in a low demand. So we can benchmark this against those comparable stores that we isolated in the pattern. So comparable stores here are the same types of stores that we identified that sell other products in a particular set of demand. Here for the Snickers king size, there are other stores that sold Snickers among other products like the Phoenix location, but they may not have been the same products that, or the same stores that sold Pepsi. So the fuzzy clustering aspect is that different stores have different demand patterns, possibly based on the locality to, let's say, a hospital or a school or an office that's still working. So all of those adjacencies among the stores are what CB4 are actually uncovering without discreetly indicating that it's because of a school, because of a hospital. We don't need to even ingest that data to uncover those types of opportunities. Instead, we just let the pattern recognition software uncover them. The way I like to think of it is consumers vote with their wallet. Here, we've indicated that consumers should be buying Snickers, but there's something preventing them from doing so. So once we've identified that the Snickers bar is an opportunity and there may be some sort of operational issue that's preventing the sale, the store manager would go walk their floor to figure out what's going on and provide CB4 with feedback. The reason that it's really important to close the loop regarding the feedback from store managers is twofold. The first aspect is that CB4 collects the feedback about whether or not there was an issue and what it was, or if this was let's say a false positive and there was no issue. CB4's machine learning engine can take that information and only propagate going forward more and more relevant opportunities for store managers to execute. We touched on that the KPI earlier, but there's a priority value within the CB4 C retail selection instance where we only want to select those high probability instances. Well, that number gets higher and higher the more information we glean from store managers, and our system continues to learn and grow as our store managers do. And the second aspect that's really important regarding the feedback that we collect from store managers is, for instance, if there are instances of out of stocks. I'm sure out of stocks is something that's plaguing all of you right now. And for those of you that are on the supply chain lines, that's probably something that you're combating while you're listening to this call right now. So if we get a lot of similar feedback for specific SKUs or categories of SKUs, that all goes up the hierarchy to both operations managers, but also possibly supply chain and merchandising managers to help uncover aggregate statistics in our CB4 dashboards. So what we're going to be able to do now is actually click through. Let's say that this issue was related to out of stock at DC supplier. The store manager gets a nice job, and then we move on to the next task. But CB4 isn't done. We've now taken that information and we're beginning to learn from it. So this brings me to the last aspect of the program, which is the CB4 dashboards. So these dashboards show high-level statistics about what store managers are actioning against, both from a dollars perspective, but also from the issues found. And you might be asking yourself, is it all worth it right now, given all that's going on? And from our existing customer bases, especially in grocery, it does seem to be. We're still able to uncover new opportunities that are incrementally increasing sales at the chain level, even with everything going on, because we're learning over a really short time frame and using artificial intelligence to predict new demand levels. But more importantly, I also want to show you some of the issues found that you're able to uncover. So specifically, as a manager using the CB4 program, you'd be able to see what your store's feedback look like, and as well as actually taking a look at different aggregates. So let's imagine we're taking a look more at stock-related issues, because that's probably what's plaguing you the most. You can see which divisions are harder hit. You can see which departments this is more relevant for. And finally, if there are particular vendors that are more or less struggling to keep up with that demand, perhaps we have that conversation. So for instance, here, maybe we want to have a conversation with our Coke rep for particular areas to see if there's something that we can do to free up their lines, or this might be information that you already have available to you, but now you can take to Coke and say, hey, Coke, not only do we know that you're struggling to keep up, we're getting a lot of feedback from our stores that there's a lot of actionability that we're missing out on, and here's how much money the potential could be. So please work with us to negotiate this. So all of this being said, what we're doing is really just trying to do our best to work with our partners in resolving in-store operational issues by finding hyperlocal demand, either through Excel reporting, a regression analysis using online data, but also using the CB4 platform to do the same. And at the end of the day, there are a couple takeaways that I'd love for you all to kind of keep in mind. So first of all, CB4 would love to offer you those same Corona reports that we touched on earlier, emerging trends and supply chain opportunities, as well as the online versus offline, free of charge we really just want to help you all in the grocery space. And I'd also just like to take a quick pause and thank you. For those of you that are coming from grocery, and those of you whose locations are still operating, inadvertently, your store managers, associates, and anyone actually working in the store have been thrust into the front lines of this pandemic. And without them, we would be really hurting as a society. The fact that our grocery and convenience spaces, I'll speak to them as well, are still remaining open is critical to our ability to continue to eat. And without your patience and without your guidance and in this trying time, we would be in a lot worse shape. So we really just, myself and everyone at CB4 just thanks you in the grocery industry for keeping open, and we really feel for your store associates and managers who are kind of having to face the challenges of the pandemic on a day-to-day basis. Beyond that, we'd love for you to contact us at hello@CB4 if you have any follow-up questions, or if you'd like to see the analysis firsthand. We would love to work with you. We'd be happy to set up an NDA to be able to transfer information and also share data if that's something that you'd be interested in. And then finally, if the AI aspect of our program was interesting to you as well, we would love to set up a call to show you a little bit more about how the program would work on your data. And again, we'd be more than happy to set up an NDA with you. You can actually reach out to me directly, ben@cb4.com. And again, I'm Ben Nichols. And that's really what we wanted to show you today.